Behind me now is all that remains of the old Chiquola mill, in operation from 1903 to 2003. And in 1934, during the United Textile Workers of America's strike, which swept across the Southeast, 7 workers were massacred right where I'm now standing. Ira Davis was only 24 when he was killed, but he was a hero of labor if ever there was one. When the Union's flying squadron came to Honey Path, they found conditions perfect for a strike, but because the company kept a tight lid on pro-Union news outlets, none of the workers even knew a strike had been steadily spreading through the Southeast over the last few days. Workers were hastily summoned to the Union Hall and told that the strike was to take place on the 6th, and importantly, made to swear an oath to come unarmed. Young Ira and his friend Maxie Peterson took this very seriously and may have actually been tasked by the Union officially to come and disarm anybody that had a gun. He was shot after initial gunfire, possibly in the back, but sources differ. 2 protesters present for the massacre told the court that a whistle was blown behind police lines, and deputies began to draw their weapons, almost as if that was the signal. This was followed by Officer John Self, who stepped forward and shouted, "Get back, if you don't, we'll kill every damned one of you." The 2 witnesses said that, on hearing this, Davis and Peterson sprang into action and surrounded the only striker who brought a gun to the demonstration, a man whose name was only given as Johnston. At the same time, Davis's brother-in-law, a man named Lee Crawford, had gotten into a scuffle with a local deputy. I'll give more information at Crawford's grave, but after the deputy fired a shot into Crawford and wounded him, a 14-year veteran of the Honey Path Police Department, Officer Charlie Smith, sprinted towards the fight. He found both men on the ground, with Crawford dazed and sitting up. Smith fired 2 shots. The first one missed. The second shot killed him. He then pivoted around and shot Davis, who seemingly wasn't involved with the scuffle at all. The only testimony I found that he was involved came from Officer Smith and the deputy who was fighting his brother-in-law, the latter of whom claimed that Davis held his arms behind his back while Crawford hit him in the head with a large stick. This is obviously untrue because the same officer claims that he never fired a shot, and that if he did fire a shot, it must have come after the initial hit, even though he also claimed that he didn't unholster his revolver. So how could he have fired a shot into Davis's brother-in-law if his arms were pinned behind his back by Ira? Before the end of the massacre, Davis and his friend Peterson, who both attempted to de-escalate the strike, were lying dead on the ground of the mill lot. 3 witnesses said the local cop, Charlie Smith, had killed Davis, but the jury found all 11 men who had been accused not guilty and ruled that the 6 were killed by, quote, unknown parties. Jesse Lee Crawford's brother-in-law, Ira Davis, and his friend, Peterson, were disarming a protester to de-escalate the situation when Officer Smith killed Crawford, then Davis. The escalation seems to have come from a scuffle between Deputy Calvert and Lee Crawford, a fight seen by 16 of the state's 22 witnesses. Calvert was deputized earlier that day, not by the sheriff, but by the company town's mayor. This deputy testified in his own defense that he was surrounded by strikers, that he never unholstered his gun, that Ira Davis pinioned his arms behind his back, and that Crawford was striking him with a club. He claimed he hadn't consciously fired a shot, but when pressed, conceded he may have inadvertently shot into Crawford after being struck. This shot was seen by several protesters. Clearly, the deputy was lying. There is no way he shot into somebody with a holstered revolver. Crawford fell into the dirt with a bullet in him, but he grabbed the deputy by the neck and tumbled down with him. Stunned, Crawford sat up to check himself when Charlie Smith sprang forward with the police and fired twice, killing him. He then pivoted around and killed his brother-in-law, Ira Davis. If we read a little between the lines here, I think it's clear what happened. Calvert was just a jumpy anti-union deputy who heard a whistle and saw actual officers like Smith readying their guns. He thought this meant to shoot and fired a shot either into the air or into the crowd. This was the first shot that was heard, the one that the United Textile Workers claimed started the escalation. Lee Crawford and others began to crowd around him and strike at him, trying to wrest his revolver away from him. Officer Smith jumped forward and shot Crawford, and when he turned around, saw Ira Davis struggling to get a gun away from one of the strikers, the only one who showed up armed. He then shot Davis. One witness, a striker named Lewis McLean, testified at trial that Davis at that point had already been hit with a billy club after being seen disarming a protester named Johnson. He was crawling on the ground, which is when he was shot in the back by Officer Smith, who thought that he might have actually seized the gun and intended to use it. It's odd that nobody directly saw that officer shoot Peterson, the second man who aided Davis in taking the gun, but Peterson was also killed. The massacre seems to have started from this fight with the jumpy Deputy Calvert. Behind the museum in town, you'll find the first monument erected in Honey Path to the Massacre of 1934. As a part of that strike, about 400,000 people across the Deep South mobilized, and South Carolina was especially militant, so the United Textile Workers of America had what they called in this state flying squadrons, people who would go from milltown to milltown to ensure that people would join in that strike. What they found here in Honey Path was that many people wanted to join, but only half were members of the Union because Dan Beecham kept such a firm grip on their personal lives that they felt they would be kicked out at any time. And because this was a town in which you were born and at age 14 you joined the mill, and your children joined the mill, and your children's children joined the mill, nobody wanted to join. But once the strike was already going and 400,000 people took part, most people came out and decided to support them on the day of September 6th, which is when the massacre began. And the park bench to the left of the monument is a little bit old and worn down, hard to read, but it commemorates Ira Davis and Lee Crawford, which confirms my suspicion that those two men were killed right alongside each other. Ira Davis was disarming the only armed protester when Lee Crawford was executed by a local police officer who turned around and then killed Ira Davis. And in order to understand how things escalated to that point, we need to understand what was happening in the Deep Southeast at the time. During the Civil War, naturally, we were an economy based in rural agriculture and cotton production. However, after the Civil War, from the 1880s forward, gradually the New England model of textile mills was brought to areas like Georgia and South Carolina. And because the price of cotton was plummeting, many families who were engaged in farm work or tenant farming had to move to towns like this one. And for a while, the company owners fostered an attitude of togetherness and family. Because you moved to a company town, attended church and company churches, and shopped at the company store, although the prices were a little bit higher and you had to pay in company money called scrib, you were always next to your coworkers. And it was, for a brief while, pretty good. The pay was significantly better than you'd get as a tenant farmer, but gradually people began to feel sort of trapped in these company towns. These are the kind of buildings I'm talking about when I say company stores, company schools, and company houses. Workers would live in these, and on the day of the massacre, Bloody Thursday, about 300 strikers from the United Textile Workers of America assembled in this parking lot. And to their horror, they discovered that the mayor and superintendent had deputized quite a few people who were anti-union and placed a machine gun on the 4th story of the Chiquola mill that he had gotten in World War I. And as the strike broke out, a shot was fired, and then all hell broke loose. And during the Great Depression, you could be expected at the age of 14 to begin your 11-hour workday and then go to the company school or to the company store. And during the Great Depression especially, they expected you to put out much more profit rather than to build this family relationship. The bosses were expecting more return on their investment, and you were their investment. So the United Textile Workers of America looked at the numbers. The numbers said that the Deep South now accounted for upwards of 70% of this nation's cotton production. And what's more, the workers here were expected to work for 40% less pay than you could get for working a factory like this up in New England. And so they initiated this strike starting on Labor Day. Well, a lot of towns didn't even get the message, Chiquola being one of them, because the mayor was also the superintendent of the factory, of the mill, and was involved with all matters of public life. He kept a tight lid on outside information pertaining to any strikes. So when the flying squadron of the Textile Workers Union came to town, they found conditions perfect for a strike, and one was organized on the 6th. And not too long ago, a huge structure from the mill, dating back to the actual uprising of 1934, caught fire and burned. And local firefighters were pretty helpless and just had to wait for it to burn down. But thankfully, it didn't take much of the building out, the brick building I'm standing in now. And you still have the iconic chimney overlooking the old Chiquola town site. And now's a good time to point out that Dan Beecham, who was not only the mayor who deputized quite a few of the anti-strike organizers, he was also the magistrate and mill superintendent. Not only did he throw his workers under the bus for the massacre, he also threw under the bus his goons, because when 11 of the people he deputized and who worked for him to break the strike were accused of murder, he simply made a public statement saying he wasn't present for the massacre. He'd gone home for breakfast. This was decades later proven to be totally false, but in that meantime he placed a gag order and no one was allowed to talk about it in town. So gradually the memory of the massacre faded from the community, that is, until his grandson in the 1990s began to talk about it and even wrote a book on the 1934 labor uprising. Claude C. Cannon was only 27 years old when he was killed in the Chiquola Mills massacre. J.R. King actually testified that Cannon was shot in the back while leaving from behind the mill and that he wasn't bothering anybody. In fact, a score of Honey Path residents claimed to have seen him and several strikers, including Knight and Peterson, buried close to him, targeted and killed, either walking away or in, quote, attitudes of surrender. E.M. Knight was one of the older mill workers at age 45. In town, 5 people said they saw Police Chief George Page kill him. Some witnesses claimed at trial that Knight, Yarborough, and Crawford were all members of the Flying Squadron, which doesn't make any sense because the Flying Squadron were out-of-town and out-of-state union workers who would come in and encourage the locals to join the union by force if necessary, and by most accounts, that wasn't needed here in Honey Path. By claiming that Knight was a member of the Flying Squadron, it seems to have taken a lot of the heat off of the chief of police, who pretty much just executed him in cold blood. And imagine losing your husband or your brother in this massacre, and then being given an order by Mayor Beecham, who also was the law in this county, to not talk about it. His wife, Eunice, lived until 1963, and the first monument to go up was only erected in the 1990s. And this is the grave of one of the older mill workers, Thomas Yarborough, and 6 witnesses in town say they saw a man named E.T.K. shoot him. He had over 10 bullets inside of him, and the doctor said that there were multiple different guns used, including a shotgun and probably a couple of pistols. As far as I can tell, Tom Yarborough's tombstone is the only contemporary monument in town to the United Textile Workers of America, and that's very important because Dan Beecham, the mayor and superintendent of the mill, placed a gag order on it. And that is shown because nobody really talked about it, and the families continued living in town, including Walter Yarborough, Thomas's son, who only died in the 70s. His wife lived all the way up until 1999. I haven't been able to locate the grave of Maxie Peterson, but it's important to point out that he was the only one who was from out of town. He was 25 and from nearby Greenville. He helped Davis disarm Johnson, the only striker who came with a weapon in spite of Union orders. He was shot when the firing died down, when his brother-in-law rushed up to him and heard his dying words. He said, "I want you to tell my wife, I went down fighting for my rights, the rights of the working man." And after the massacre, J.R. McCoy, the coroner for this area, discovered that all 7 had been killed with shots to the back, which is absurdly ridiculous. And of course, after this, people began to claim that this massacre was caused by out-of-state organizers, or bad actors, or communists, or socialists, and that's when Dan Beecham placed a gag order.